Okay, so I guess the floor is mine now. Correct me if I'm wrong. If not, I'm going to start speaking about open source, how it is seen now, and what has changed due to the release of the study on the economic impact of open source in the European economy. Unfortunately, I don't speak Greek, so I will have to do it in English. My name is Luis Busquets, and I work in DigiConnect in the unit E2, which is the unit which deals with cloud computing and software. It is not strange that we actually include software between the cloud computing unit priorities, because in order to provide cloud services, we need to add a lot of things inside ICT in order to have the devices that actually provide with cloud services. From the sand of the beach, passing through the building, the micro processors, and the different devices to produce servers, and finally the software to provide the services that are needed. Lots of software are in. What's more, we are seeing how software is more and more used inside all devices. When I was in university in the 90s, there were many functions that were implemented in hardware, such as, for example, the Butterworth filters. I remember a whole subject on this. Now you would actually expect to do it digital and then to implement certain functions in software. Also, we are seeing up from this value chain for the production of cloud services. We have seen that the open source communities have managed to build a complete open stack from the kernel up to the application level. However, it is also true that below the kernel level, things are still not so open. And when we go to the specific processor architectures, embedded software, the electronics that lie behind are still something that are closed. Anyway, we have run this study on open source, and this study is covering not just the software part, but actually we have said, well, that now open source has spilled out from its origins in the software sector, in IT, and now we are seeing more and more open source hardware things. And when we go to hardware things, then, well, actually there are a myriad of applications, myriad of technologies that actually can be used and can be classified of open source hardware, even if they are to a certain extent fundamentally different. We wanted to know what is the current role, position, and potential for the next decade of open source. But not only that, we wanted to quantify and see what was the economic impact of open source software and hardware. It is obvious that the level of maturity of open source software and open source hardware are fundamentally different. If we speak about open source software, we can say that it's now mainstream. Top 500 HPCs in the world are using open source. In your devices at home, your smart TVs, your routers, well, come on, there is a possibility, 3 possibilities out of 4 that they are running open source inside. And also, we are seeing that consumer electronics and many devices are adopting open source. Nobody in the IT sector can just stay away of open source existing, either for one reason or the other, but has to be considered in this strategy. And also, it is also true that open source hardware is still in an emerging phase. However, it shares with open source software a number of properties, of characteristics that could perfectly report to open source hardware, if not the same, at least a similar or an homologous way in the next decade as what has happened to open source during the previous decade. Anyway, we're speaking about open source beyond software. Why? Because we are seeing how 3D printing is changing the paradigms. We are seeing open electronics. We are seeing really open source hardware platforms at different levels, at the level of the device, at the level of the electronics, at the level of the processor. Actually, all this started when the European Commission organized a workshop in Brussels on what to think about open source beyond 2020. And the truth was that we were seeing how there were more and more fab labs throughout the world, which said that actually no longer open source communities could just be classified on software, but actually that we were seeing also open source hardware being deployed. And actually, when we come to, for example, the processor, we speak about the RISC-V architecture processor, and well, that also brings to another level of understanding either hardware and also software, because you're able to go to a lower level of abstraction when you go to even the processor architecture level. Anyway, there are today many tools that allow us to build open source hardware. We can speak about Pronterface to do 3D printing based on a source code. Basically, instead of getting a compiled version, what you get is a piece. You can speak about Slicer to create this. With OpenSCAD, you can just modelize in 3D something that you will then obtain in the real world. And not only we're speaking about plastic or metallic things, but also about electronic circuits. We have pretty nice tools with KiCad, but we also have got Inkscape for doing images for laser engraving, and a whole number of things that actually make us that from a source code we get physical parts. Anyway, the study that I have mentioned, the study on the economic impact of open source software, wanted to analyze all this impact of both software and hardware at macro and microeconomic level. The study is also focusing on use cases. Arduino, RISC-V, RevRap, Nextcloud, Xroad are very interesting cases to actually discuss on what has happened with open source. And also the study has made a literature review of the latest advancements in open source. More than 150 publications were screened, and also experts were interviewed together with a stakeholder survey and an analysis of public policies that are being carried out by administrations throughout the world. The survey, of course, identified key points in open source. First, there are very important economic issues to deal with open source. Well, for one, we know that it can represent cost saving for companies, getting things at marginal pricing. We also know that switching costs and network effects prevent us from changing from proprietary to open technologies. But actually this, I would say that it's already 15 years at least that we know. We also know that from a market competition, it's good the existence of open source, because then we actually start building ecosystems with more entrants and with more possibilities for EU citizens to get products for more people from different manufacturers. There are anyway certain technical issues that have to be solved. Well, to a certain extent, if there are specific proprietary solutions, the incompatibility of open source solutions to these ones that are well established may suppose a problem for them to really compete and really represent an alternative to them. Also on security, on usability, but also on, well, there are issues concerning how communities are governed. What is also true is that open source represents rendering obsolete software piracy, which is quite a different thing from what I lived at university, where you could see that actually software piracy was at its own will throughout the university campuses. However, well, since now no one with open source is trying to make the benefit on the royalty for selling the software, well, the fact that you have the software doesn't care, because what you're going to pay is for the service. So we basically make this crime, this offense of software piracy, obsolete with it. Anyway, the study I told you that was analyzing the open source at microeconomic level, and that means with use cases, but also at macro level. And when we are interested at macro level, because after all, we are a public administration, and we want to make sure that what we do has an impact in the economy as a whole. If we concentrate on specific things, maybe we will go to a sum zero game, and we will not actually make the whole economy advance. So the study actually has built a macroeconomic model to understand to what extent open source is actually positive as a whole. Indeed, 15 years ago, there were people who were saying, well, open source, it's a problem because for my business is going bad. Yeah, for other business will be going well. Well, to a certain extent, as public administration, we have to care that in the end, the whole means more economy for Europe, so that the European Union actually, with the actions that are taken in open source, well, gets a total benefit that is over the scenario in which we would not act.
Mr. Lee, you have 5 minutes left.
Oh, sorry, then I'm going to go very, very quick. So main outcomes of the study, confirmation of big impact of open source, really good cost benefit. It makes a lot of interest to invest in open source, because every euro that you will put, you will get 4 euros actually. And also a forecast that an increase of 10% of open source contributions would generate an additional 0.4 to 0.6 GDP increase, which is certainly important from a European administration perspective. Also, the change, if open source was yes or no 15 years ago, what we have come to the conclusion, and the study has actually come out with this economic science advance, is that open source is a public good. And as public good can be used for many things. Actually, open source is to digital as would be a fountain in a village to the villagers. Everybody is able to use the water of the fountain for what it wants. And actually, the fact that this water works pretty well is a benefit for the whole economy as a whole. And also the thing that in order to maximize the return in Europe, this requires European policies to be taken. Actually, if we speak about the main reason why we're pushing for open source is the fact of ensuring European digital autonomy, which doesn't mean that Europe is alone on its own. It means that Europe is able to defend its values, and Europe is able to act on its own if it were necessary. But Europe does not need to be isolated in this case, and that's not what we want to. Indeed, as I told you, we now are in the verge of a new revolution, evolution, or maybe it's just vaporware. But what is true is that we're able to convert open source into parts, into hardware. And it has to be seen how this will be changing the world and how this will change the economy. Anyway, from a European perspective, I would like to share this a slide with you. This slide is not mine. It's from the European Laboratory for Open Computing Architecture. And it refers to what I have spoken before. We see how the open source communities have built a complete open stack from the kernel up to the application level. However, below is still closed. And the Commission is already taking steps in order to make sure that there are open alternatives so that whoever wants can use one product or the other below, because it's no longer locked into particular vendors. And I would like now to actually share with you an action that is happening under the Horizon Europe Work Program 2021-22, which concerns precisely that, the development of interfaces that go below the kernel level and that would allow to have open alternatives with new processing architectures developed under the European Processor Initiative for the possibility to deploy complete cloud stacks on open stacks from the processor level up to the service level.